Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Amit Kumar, your host for today's edition of Takshila's special series called The Iran Brief, where we talk about the developments emerging from the Iran war, which is already into its 33rd day as we speak. The agenda for today's episode is to evaluate the responses of three countries which might not be a direct stakeholder in the war, not a direct participant in the war, but still are major stakeholders. And these are China, Russia, and North Korea. And if you add Iran to the mix, the US likes to refer to them as CRINK, right? And therefore, we thought it would be useful to talk about how China, Russia, and North Korea, within this CRINK, are assessing the war. And to discuss this matter further, I have with me my guest Anushka Saxena. She has been closely following the developments emerging from the region, and I thought it would be useful to draw from her experience and insights. So, Anushka, welcome to the episode.
Thank you so much for having me here, Amit.
Okay, Anushka, so the first question, and I'll dive in straight to China. And my question is with regards to China, of course. Uh, there have been multiple assessments, multiple takes that people have put forth, wherein they have said that China, being the second most powerful country in the world, uh, which has a global stature, wherein is placed right after the US, has greatly benefited from this system. The Now the system no more exists, but what the system existed was the liberal international order or the world order that it was referred to as. But despite having benefited from that order, people expected more from China. Increasingly now, as the US starts behaving as a rogue state, right? Undermining the very global order that it helped build with the rest of the world and especially with the West, right? And China also had a stake. But so far, what we have seen ever since Trump has come in, uh, US has been continuously undertaking efforts that has undermined this global order. And China being a stakeholder in that, you would expect China also being the second largest economy and the second most powerful country to, step in and shoulder some responsibility in preserving that ecosystem, preserving that world order. But so far, and this is despite the fact that Iran, which is one of the closest partners of Beijing, is right now under attack, the concerted attack from US and Israel, right? And you would expect China to do something about this, right? In that manner, and that sense, people have said that China has not stepped up. What is your assessment? How is China looking at the war? Uh, do you think this is something which is in China's interest? As as people have pointed out, that this largely drags US resources towards West Asia and frees up, for China to undertake whatever actions that it would like to take in South China Sea or in East Asia or larger Asian order, right? How do you assess China's response to this war? How is China assessing the war? Is it thinking that this is something which is undermining its interests, or does it think that this is something which largely favors their strategic interests?
Right. Thank you so much for that, Amit. I think, firstly, let's zoom out, get a perspective of China's theoretical worldview vis a vis the liberal international order, vis a vis its role in the war in West Asia, and then maybe we could go a bit by bit to the brass tacks and talk about what China's interests and stakes in the war itself are, which, by the way, we've also discussed in a previous podcast, just focusing on China. But like you mentioned today, our conversation will be focused on the new axis of evil or the axis of upheaval or CRINK, as you refer to it, right? So, broadly, and I'm borrowing from Oriana Skylar Mastro's book here. She wrote a book in 2024 called Upstart: How China Became a Global Power. And the framework that she's deploying to understand what China envisions its own role as being in the liberal international order is that of an upstarter firm in the business domain. So, what she's arguing is that China's participation in certain multilateral institutions, even in certain arms control regimes, or even in the UNSC and its various mechanisms, in the nuclear suppliers group, all of these voluntary admissions to certain multilateral institutions is because it follows a 3E framework of emulation, exploitation, and entrepreneurship. So, China wants to emulate the US in certain ways. So, by trying to participate in certain multilateral conversations or in building of the liberal international order, as it were, China is trying to project its role as a great power akin to the US. Where it doesn't participate or where it holds back or where, despite benefiting from the order, it has not necessarily been as vocal or as active as the US, it is following, in Mastro's view, the concepts of exploitation and entrepreneurship. So let's keep entrepreneurship for us to the side for a minute, which essentially refers to China building self-reliance, China not wanting to play by the rules because that constrains its own scientific and technological progress. And so all of that is where you see the rogue side of things when it comes to China. But exploitation is where it's essentially benefiting from the order, buying technological design talent, absorbing talent, buying design, buying technological know-how, pardon me, buying products, components, and everything else that it needed to grow, all the while undertaking actions that just reassure the West that its rise is not militaristic. Its rise is peaceful. That's the image it wants to project, which is why you will never see it trying to shirk away from, let's say, participation in peacekeeping operations or participation in other UN mechanisms on human rights. But in all the while, what it will be doing is it will be building capability internally and hide and bide or whatever, keep it under the wraps insofar as the West remains reassured. So I know there's a lot of threads here, but broadly this is Mastro's idea, which I think explains to quite some extent, if you just have to look at it from the perspective of that one external driver that explains China's behavior, which is the US. If you're just looking at it in that limited POV, it upstart as a theory and the 3E framework explain to some extent why China has benefited quite a lot from the liberal international order, and yet it has stayed back from being as active or militaristic as the US has been. Of course, what is interesting is also that there are major internal drivers at play here, which is China's economic situation, it not wanting to sabotage that more than it already has in the past 2 years. Because let's face it, the world has changed a lot between 2024 and today, when Oriana Scalar Mastro wrote her book. And the other internal factor is capability. It not just intent but also capability, right? It cannot be as expansionist or have the ambitions that the US does. So in this regard, if we look at the brass tacks, if we look at China's interests, what the features of its response have been, there are, as always, broadly three. One is your diplomatic narrative, diplomatic wrangling and some narrative therein. One is your economic and one is military. Now, last first, if we look at the military contributions, China has clearly refrained from providing Iran with the kind of support one would expect, because because these four economies are joined together in an anti-West alliance. China has always refrained from wanting to be projected that way, but also from actively contributing to an engagement like this. So militarily, the most China has been able to do is provide Iran with certain stealth radars, provide the Houthis and the IRGC with satellite data, and most of that data has been provided by these public-private companies in China, which means that the Chinese party state can say that there is some differentiation here between what Beijing is doing and what Chinese players are doing. So like Minzar Vision, for example, which is a Shanghai-based firm, provided Iran with the locations of F-22 Raptors in the Gulf bases, in the US's Gulf bases, or even THAAD radars and their placement. Houthis, there's a company called Changwang. It's a telecom firm that has provided satellite data to the Houthis for their operations in the Red Sea. So militarily, it's been this combination of data, satellite intelligence, and some radar, stealth radar capabilities. It is reported that the Chinese have exported YLC-08 radars to the Iranians. Of course, they haven't been able to help the Iranians, say, circumvent the decapitation of their leaders at the scale and speed with which the Israelis were able to achieve. But it is some support. You can call it that way. And of course, if you look at Iran's own production line, a lot of its semiconductor components or its or the components for its drones are coming in from China. These are dual use, but eventually have enabled Iran to scale up its military industrial complex in the way that we've seen it has. On the economic front, of course, for China, I think the big numbers lie in the oil and the energy story. China tried to secure some of its supplies by buying stakes in Algerian oil blocks. It had struck deals with the Egyptians. It has Wang Yi has been on a phone call with almost all West Asian economies regarding safety, security of the Strait of Hormuz. It has been wrangling with Iran as well. But again, the fact is that there is some security in the Chinese party state from what we understand, because they entered 2026 with a reserve of about 104 days of net imports worth of oil and energy. Plus, they have invested truly in diversification, so they also have a lot of green technology options in the mix. So that combined, the green technology options combined with certain reserve capability, combined with diplomacy, they have been able to circumvent the loss of that 13% that came in from Iran. Of course, there are other economic factors, because sustained and prolonged closures of the Strait of Hormuz like this impact oil prices. They lead to the depreciation of reserves faster, all of which are genuine problems China is facing. Not to mention the attacks on its expatriates and its BRI investments in the Gulf, which are virtually unprotected at this juncture. And finally, there's the diplomatic wrangling. Now we know, and this is where I'll end very quickly, but we know that China appointed a special envoy for mediation in the Middle East, Cai Chun. Cai Chun did a lot of shuttle diplomacy, a lot of back and forth across the Gulf Arab countries. In the meantime, Wang Yi was on a phone call with the French, the Russians, the Egyptians, the British, and in all of that, what China has been able to conclude and position, and in terms of its position. Of course, the Pakistanis, which is of utmost importance, Ishaq Dar was just in Beijing. They concluded a 5-point plan on how they propose to bring peace to Iran. And in all of this, one position of China that is clear is that they will always condemn the war on account of it being a violation of sovereignty, territorial integrity, rules of war fighting, international law, and all of that. But there is very little they can do about stopping the US Israeli alliance, which is why the best option for them diplomatically is to make sure that their interests are communicated to the Gulf Arab countries, are communicated to the Iranians in the news and official conversations. Their foreign ministry, Mao Ning, Guo Tiankun, Lin Jian, all of these people have been constantly talking about how they appreciate Tehran's firm response. They appreciate that Russia is helping them, Pakistan is helping them mediate the whole affair. But essentially, beyond that, they will only come in to broker peace when it will be initiated itself by the parties in the conflict, which is where China's role becomes most indirect, yet the most popularized by Beijing itself.
No, yeah, makes sense. I mean, I also find that these criticisms about China not doing enough to protect the order. I mean, yeah, I mean, I agree with that, but then again, the criticism is slightly unfounded. I think what else would you expect China to do in this case? I mean, it's one thing to preserve the world order when the ruckus is being created by middle powers or smaller powers. You can go and stamp your authority and just tell them to fall in line, right? But when it's the biggest and the most powerful country itself that undertakes this adventure, of upending the world order. What else do you expect China to do apart from uh, contributing diplomatically and then again aiding the other side as well? It cannot uh, enter into the war, put boots on the ground. That will have complications for its internal economic situation, domestic situation. And I wouldn't, if I was China's leader, I wouldn't want China to enter somebody else's war. Why would I? Given the challenges that I already have back at home. So I think when people criticize, they need to also come up with uh, suggestions as to what more can China do. I really want China to do more, but then there has to be some suggestions on that front as to what else can China do. Now, related matter is, of course, now there. If I understand China's interests in this war correctly, I think there are three things. Three threats, right? One is that China might find this situation favorable because uh, it preoccupies, keeps the US preoccupied in a war in some another region, and that therefore frees up resources here. Second, the second concern for the Chinese would be that given Iran is a close partner, regime change, and if the US and Israel get some sort of a strategic advantage in that region, that wouldn't bode well for the balance of power and for the Chinese interest, right? And there's a third strand where this China can see this as an opportunity to the Iran war as an opportunity to field its weapons and test them against the Americans, right? Which they can gather more information, and I'm sure they must have done it also during the Russia-Ukraine ongoing war, right? So how do you think China is looking at this third strand of maybe the third kind of interest that it might have in this war, and what are the some of the systems that it has delivered to Iran, and how what are the assessments so far that has come out, given the kind of weapon deployment from both the sides, and what are the insights the Chinese have gained against the American systems when it has fielded its own systems.
Right. I think on quickly on just the first 2 points, I think, and this is something we've discussed often at Takshashila. um, yes, it is useful for Beijing to see the US and its resources bogged down in the Iran war. Of course, if there are three aircraft carriers in the Strait of Hormuz, or in the near abouts areas, there are that those are three less aircraft carriers to be deployed in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. Sure, but I think where this could become tricky is when it comes to regime change or boots on the ground, because that's where you're talking about potentially a prolonged conflict, a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and even which brings itself with itself economic costs. And then there is the regime that you would have to deal with. Now, I do think that the Chinese would have the capability and willingness to engage with, offer concessions, to seek concessions from anyone who comes out at the top when the dust settles. Doesn't have to be 9th of April, as Trump believes. It could be a much later as well. But I think the Chinese will have the capability and the willingness to engage with whomsoever comes out of this. But I'm sure they must be enjoying the show when Iranian attacks on GCC based US bases, or on Israel, Tel Aviv in particular, when they come to fruition. That said, as to the military support, as I already mentioned, there are reports that suggest Chinese YLC-08 radar systems, or stealth radar systems, which have touted themselves as being the most effective against F-22 Raptors or F-35 Lightning aircraft of the Americans. They have been fielded in Iran. But I think where the support is most prominent is in the dual use components. If we look at the Iranian drone production ecosystem, the Iranian drone strikes have, of course, been the highlight of the tactical aspects of this conflict. And in Shahid 136 or Shahid 129, which are some of the most popular drones the Iranians have used, it is highly likely that the semiconductor components, the electro-optical sensor suite, some bits of the airframe are all things that either they have purchased from the Turks and the Gulf Arab states as a normal export barter, which they eventually stockpiled, or they have either imported or reverse engineered it from the Chinese. Reverse engineering in Iran's Mado complex in particular is very popular, and again, that is the place where, you know, they reverse engineer and produce things that have filtered in through China, but were imported first by China from the British or the French or the Russians. So I think that is a major contribution that has come in from China to Iran's military successes. And then, of course, the most important is the satellite data on US base placement, on US aircraft carrier positions, on US's positions in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, which have then translated into satellite data from Python 3 navigation systems being provided to the Houthis. Broadly, it is this, but in terms of fielding turnkey Chinese products, as they've done in Pakistan, let's say we're talking the J-10, we're talking HQ-9 surface-to-air missile systems. None of that is likely going to be happening in Iran's case. In fact, when the report came out a few days ago, a few weeks ago, Reuters reported that the Chinese have exported the CM-302 anti-submarine missile to the Iranians. Not only did the foreign ministry say no, not a deal like this has happened, they shirked away. They said that we behave like a responsible power does, and we're not selling anything like this to the Iranians. And this is because the Chinese have to comply with the broader international arms embargoes that are placed on Iran by the United Nations Security Council. So, to if we go back to the abstract framework and to China's role in the liberal international order, if in its foreign policy statements is going to say that we uphold the UN Charter, we uphold the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, it also has to act in accordance with the arms embargoes, right? So a lot of these under the table deals, this satellite navigation data, dual use components, all of that is happening undoubtedly. No such turnkey products that can speak to Chinese in like Chinese flagship weapons capabilities through Iran
Yeah,
is something. It's not something we're going to see anytime soon.
quite interesting. I mean, and that note, I think, and that's also because Iran itself is, when it comes to military weapons, Iran itself has a huge, expansive capacity and
Yeah.
capability, right? And and that brings me to the question of Russia. So Russia, when it was when and it's still engaging in the Eastern Europe front, and it has been uh, taking help of the Iranian Shahed 136 drones in its campaign in the eastern Ukraine, right? Uh, and now that we see that the US and Israel have entered into a warlike situation with Iran, and where Iran's resources are stretched, uh, how does it impact Russia's advances and its campaign in Eastern Europe and Eastern Ukraine? And how is Russia coping up with that problem? And is Iran actually being has Iran actually been able to service the demands put forth by the Russians, and also simultaneously cater for whatever requirements it has uh, with the requirements it has vis-a-vis US and Israel. So what's the development on that front?
Right. So I think about Shahid 136s, yes, it is true that they have been exported to the Russians. And there are only one or two numbers on this across the internet. This demands a study that I think we're going to be trying and taking up at Takshashila. But in terms of Iran's drone kind of, I don't know, stockpile or inventory, there is one number from a UK based analyst, which is that it is likely to have 80,000 Shahids or drones as a whole in its inventory. And it
That's
has,
Iran.
that's Iran,
Yeah.
yes. And Iran seems to have approximately used 3,000 drones in its campaign since February 28 to today. 3,000, maybe upwards of 50, upwards plus minus 50 drones, right? So if let's say it's not 80,000, let's say it's 50,000 drones in Iran's inventory. Clearly, they are truck launched or mobile vehicle launched, which makes their launch facilities also a little bit more immune to counterstrikes than perhaps missile interceptors, which Israel claims to have destroyed 60% of in Iran's case. And then there is the production facility that you have built, that Iran has built in a manner that it can service its drone requirements while it exports. And the Shahids themselves have been exported in the past 2-3 years. I'm not hearing of numbers for 2025-26, which is the period in which Iran has had two conflicts with Israel, and then, of course, Israel and the US. So I think Iran has an inventory that can take it to a few more months of conflict based on the kind of drone strikes it is doing now. That would be a best level guesstimate. A few months, maybe 3 months or so. In the meantime, it will keep replenishing its inventory because of how it has framed its defense industrial complex right now. And as for Russia, I think Shahids aren't the only thing in
Options,
their
inventory.
arsenal, right?
Yeah.
They have a bunch of missile interceptors. They do good work with, they do great work with S-300s and S-400s. They have a bunch of other drones, and they have a large defense industrial base. So it is likely that the deliverability of Shahids isn't going to be a huge problem for the Russians. And it is also possible that in a few months Iran says that it has a stable enough inventory to continue with its
Right.
exports. I think the real question is where Russian exports of military equipment are helping Iran. The S-300s and the S-400s that the Iranians field
Yeah.
haven't necessarily been able to protect the decapitation and the strikes against all of their new leadership as and when it props up, right? Arakchi is gone, Khamenei is gone, the IRGC Navy chief is gone, his deputy is gone, and so many others are gone as well, right? They have a militia, its chief and deputy are gone. So clearly, the surface to air missiles that Iran was using from Russia, it had also imported some missile fuel equipment from North Korea. All of that hasn't done the best it could to protect Iran at home from F-35 or F-22 or even F-16 strikes, right? Which the US fields in its Qatari and Kuwaiti bases. That said, I think so the S-300s and the S-400s haven't done the best. But you brought up Eastern Europe, and there's what is interesting to note about how this conflict may slightly be benefiting Russia, or could benefit in the future Russia vis-a-vis its campaign in Ukraine. Just a tad bit, just
Yeah.
a small component could be that the US is now thinking of halting the exports or the provisions of its attack ms to Ukraine. Attack ms is army tactical missile system to Ukraine. Now Ukraine wasn't using it a lot, but it had definitely been able to achieve certain advances vis-a-vis Russia in 2024 and early 2025. So now the US is considering halting those and sending its attack MSs to the Gulf region. And that could mean one less weapon system the Ukraine has from the US vis-a-vis Russia. So that could be a little bit of help. And of course, the other thing is the economic security side of things, which is if you look at Brent crude numbers, 30% rise in oil prices per barrel since the conflict started. It has gone from $60 or $70 per barrel to $100. All of those are things that are indispensable and buoy the Russian economy in its own kind of campaign vis-a-vis Ukraine in a way that, of course, will help it in the short to medium term. In the long term, we don't know how spike in oil prices, what could it mean for major oil exporters, because it could also mean countries trying to grapple with diversification alternatives, so on and so forth. But we're talking 3-4 years down
Yeah.
the line here.
Yeah. Yeah. And another issue, I mean, question from that would be important from Russia's point of view would be the question around regime change and getting the regime out. So US started with an war objective of regime change, even though it was not stated clearly, it became quite clear that they wanted a regime change. And in the past, when similar such attempts were being made to dislodge Bashar al-Assad in Syria, Russia had extended support, right? On this front, do you see Russia extended any support to the Iranians on regime stability and preserving the regime against whatever? I mean, the U.S. and Israelis have decapitated much of the senior most leaders of Iran. But from that perspective, is there anything that the Russians are aiding and helping the Iranians in preserving this regime?
Yeah, no, that's definitely an interesting one, and I think my answer would broadly, in a few words, would be it's going to be a wait and watch scenario, because I don't think the Russians or the Chinese even together would be able to prevent maybe a non potentially even a non IRGC leader or coming into power, or maybe the executive supreme council that the Iranians have. Maybe a new leader emerges in a different way, but again, like I said, there'll be willingness to engage with them, but I think mainly where we could see Russia playing a role is in the barter, that is whatever, weapons for sovereignty or oil for sovereignty, right? Which is exactly what the Russians did with Bashar al-Assad,
Yeah.
which was that they supported Syria whatever way they could, sometimes quite drastically, but that came in exchange of Russian private security military companies consistently being placed in Syria, Russia consistently taking charge of their security and their decision making. So a little bit of Assad's sovereign capabilities went to Russia in
Yeah.
exchange for that major drastic barter, right?
Yeah.
if if we do imagine Iran going for something like that at a time when it is completely decimated, the economy is not doing so well, it will likely come at the expense of the new regime having to kowtow to the Russians to quite an extent. It could mean, and there was some discussion, some projections that Iran would be offering 40 to 45% discount on some of its own crude to the Russians. They might or might not need it, but it might have to offer a discount like this to the Russians and the North Koreans or the Chinese in exchange for the kind of support it might need 3 months
Yeah.
down the
Yeah.
line when it is completely decimated. And so whoever the new regime would be, if it wants its kind of SAM inventory stockpiled, its drone dual components coming in, it might have to give more to the Russians and even the Chinese than it perhaps, and perhaps equal to what it gets back. And that is exactly what we saw with Assad as well.
Yeah. And I think it's quite difficult to save a regime from with external aid, and we have seen examples of this, right? Uh, Russia in Afghanistan, Russia in Syria, and then even U.S. in Afghanistan after, when 2021 Taliban eventually took over, right? So it's difficult to sustain that momentum and save the regime, preserve the regime if the local conditions are not in your favor. Uh, Now, coming on to North Korea. Now, while the world has been busy with epic fury, right? North Korea has ramped up its missile program. Do you think this is an opportunistic move that the North Koreans have made? And do you think there's some kind of arrangement among these countries, the CRINK countries, that they have to stretch the American resources so thin that it comes to a breaking point eventually, right? So, what are your thoughts? How is North Korea reacting to the war? What are its responses? And it seems to have picked a very opportunistic moment to ramp up its missile program in Sea of Japan.
Yeah. So I think there is one thing that I would first say broadly, which is that North Korea ramping up its missile program is as new as US acting as a rogue state. Both
Mm.
of them are not new, right? But and of course, the North Koreans have like the one lesson they would be drawing, and they've consistently talked about it. But the one lesson their faith would be renewed in would be that a country needs a nuclear program, a country needs to act on hard power, even if it means starving its own citizens, right? The Iranians did it to some extent. They faced a huge brunt of economic sanctions in trying to build the bomb, something that they admitted to in 2002, and then it was revealed in Stuxnet, in the Stuxnet cyber campaign in 2010. But still, it was pretty much so clear that Iran wanted to build a nuclear facility, right? And for that, they endured a lot of harsh. Kind of sanctions, and they fared relatively well if some other data is to be believed, right? But the North Koreans were actually able to build nuclear capabilities, a ballistic and conventional missile program. So their faith in that would be strengthening. Firstly, that might be a sweeping claim, but I think that normatively that could be the case. The other thing which pertains to an arrangement between the CRINK economies could be something like this, right? North Koreans have imported a lot of Russian equipment, especially missile fuel. Picker upper aircraft that carry missile fuel. So I'm talking about the Ilyushin 76 and the Antonov 124, if I'm not wrong. So Il 76 and An 124 are aircraft that have definitely made sorties between the Sunan International Airport in Pyongyang and Tehran. So these have flown, these could be carrying solid fuel, solid fuel for rockets. And what solid fuel in particular does is that liquid fueled missiles they have a 30 to 50 minute prep time before they can be launched. So an F-35 could just make a sortie by then, bomb it, and make sure that they don't even get to take off. But solid fuel's prep time is much lower. So if the Iranians would need it, they could get it through Soviet repurposed planes from North Korea. And because North Korea is literally in a state where it has much less left to lose, it doesn't care about those international arms embargo sanctions that China or even Russia would otherwise have to be concerned about. More China than Russia, and certainly much more than North Korea, right? So that's definitely something that's been reported, well documented. Those flights from Sunan to Tehran are something to take care of. And of course, the other thing is then the little bit of, I think this connects to the first point rather than the second, which is about direct support. The North Koreans would also be watching what happens to the THAAD radar systems that are placed in South Korea, right? Those have been a matter of huge hue and cry, not just for the North Koreans but also for the Chinese. And 1 or 2 weeks ago, the US said that it's going to want to move those and airlift them, THAAD radar replacements, to the Middle East, to West Asia, and so it is possible if those go away, North Koreans have certain sense of security. But does that mean we are going to see a reordering or a remilitarization of the Korean peninsula? I don't know, but I certainly wouldn't count on it until and unless the coast is much clearer and the US and the Israelis are losing much more badly than maybe what the situation is like today.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating, very fascinating to learn. Uh, we are short of time, but before I let you go, I have one final question for you. We started with the question on world order, right? But now, post COVID, what we have seen so far is the world has seen and witnessed a series of wars, right? In the past 6 years, we have seen multiple wars, and there's a consensus that the world order has ruptured, right? So, what is your take on how would the next world order emerge or evolve from this war when this eventually ends after the Russia-Ukraine war and this U.S. Israel-Iran war ends? What are we likely to see in terms of the new world order?
Right. So I think I'm not one to make a comment on all the restructuring that could happen, because every new event induces a sort of trigger for something else. The repercussions for which we see only 5 to 10 years down the line. But I think three broad things are starkly evident. One is just about the rules of war fighting itself. I think the way drone war fighting and dual use component exports in the arms ecosystem have restructured and democratized war fighting is most starkly evident A, with Ukraine, and B, more recently with Iran. I think when war fighting becomes this accessible because of something like drones,
Yeah.
it is definitely a revolution in military affairs that we should watch out for, because that will have an important impact on how countries across the world prepare their own militaries, right? So the Chinese becoming major global exporters of drones, the Americans reverse engineering Shahid
Shahid. Yeah.
drones
Yeah.
to build their own low cost
Yeah.
USs,
Lucas.
right?
Yeah.
Lucas. And then how that impacts CENTCOM's doctrine or anyone else's doctrine. All of these things are repercussions that you're going to see the impacts of for a long time, and that will obviously lead to some restructuring of the global security order. Then, in terms of the economic order, I think the thing to watch out for is the importance of oil, the restructuring of supply chains, the push for alternatives. Again, there is a lot of debate on dependence on China for green
Yeah.
technology, for hydrogen, pardon me, fuel cells. Will that de-risking become harder to achieve, because it's always oil that is impacted, because most of the oil exporters are either in
Yeah.
West
Yeah.
Asia or
Yeah.
in Russia, and it's going to take many days, even months, for oil to come from the US. So not everyone can rely there. Venezuela is impacted. So how is the politics of energy going to be impacted? I think there's going to be major restructuring there, and de-risking in green technologies is going to become harder. So it's going to be self-reliance or not. Again, maybe sweeping, but maybe something that we might as well see very clearly 5 years down the line.
Yeah.
And finally, there is the idea of liberal rules based international order and
Mm.
the binization of or the iron curtain or the silicon curtain. There have been many curtains that have been discussed in the past few years, but it is very much so likely, with the way things are going, with these new alliances and groupings emerges, it is possible that there are many curtains. The Middle East or West Asia itself might enter a treaty alliance. It could be the case that if Trump tomorrow says that we can't cater for your security, so you must cater for it yourself. The Gulf Arab countries might have to come together in a much more formal alliance than today
Yeah.
for reservicing their military requirements, and that could eventually turn into something economic or something more holistic down the line. In the meantime, CRINK could come closer, and the Western Hemisphere could become its own thing with its own geopolitics, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that those curtains could be something that would be interesting to watch out in the new world
That's
order.
very fascinating, Anushka. And I think the most important key takeaway from your 5 points that I have is the rules of war fighting is changing, and the question for India is India prepared? With that, I think Anushka, we had a lovely conversation today. I think I had a lot of takeaways. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners also had a lot of fun watching this conversation. And I'm sure you'll not find this kind of conversation anywhere else. So do tune in to Takshila's All Things Policy and our Iran Brief, a special series where we track developments on Iran. With that, it's a wrap. Thank you so much.
Thank you.